I want to share with you a tool that we use at Podcasting U called Rephonic. Now, there's a couple of different tools out there, with one of them being called Listen Notes. And I've used both Listen Notes and Rephonic, and I find Rephonic to be the best podcast database searching tool. So, for searching a podcast by topic, as an example, we could do like, let's say, real estate investing. And I always just put quotation marks around it, just personal preference. So you can see we're 22 total million listeners. Gives you some social numbers, some listener numbers, and basically you could just like go through here and check it out. And then some things like what I would recommend doing is if like you're someone that's newer and wants to go on podcasts, you could sort by like let me move this for a sec. You could sort by, and for those that are listening to this podcast, yeah, I'd recommend checking out the YouTube version of it. But within Rephonic, you can sort by new podcast. So you could sort by, these are going to be your newer real estate shows, where if you're someone that is newer and wants to go on some shows, but is again new to the space, these are typically the shows that I'd recommend to have you target. You could do like, there's a more button, you could click that. You could sort by number of episodes. So if you wanted to make sure, even if it is a new podcast, you want to make sure it has at least 10 episodes. You can sort by rating. So if you want to make sure that it has, say, 25 reviews, at least 25 reviews on iTunes, you can sort by the amount of listeners. So if I wanted to shoot for podcasts that have 1K listeners and up, then I would target that podcast. You can sort by shows that have only done podcasts within the last 45 days. You could do your language. So, like, let's say if we wanted to do English, you could do gender. And for those listening, you could do, if you're, say, only wanting to go on male dominant shows, only wanting to go on female dominant shows, you can do that. You can say, make sure that the podcast has guests or interviews. You can select that. You can select their total social media reach. You can select their location in the United States. So there's just a lot that you can do with Rephonic. And honestly, these are like all the things that when we're working with a client that I recommend doing. And then you can sort by like category. So like, even though we typed in real estate, we want to make sure it's like business and investing. Podcasts that accept sponsors or advertisements, you can select, you know, podcasts that have a YouTube channel. You can select how often it publishes, whether it's daily, weekly, twice weekly, monthly, and frequently. So, I mean, there's a lot of tools that you can use with Orphonic. Now, it's not 100% accurate all the time. Sometimes it might show a show, and maybe that show doesn't have an episode that comes out every week, but I find for the good majority of the time, it is very helpful. And something I find that's cool. So let's click on this podcast. So passive real estate strategy. Let's see how often he publishes. So obviously that's not going to be a weekly podcast. But what this is pulling in is that when you go to iTunes and you submit your podcast to iTunes, you have to select how often the frequency of the podcast is. Do you plan on publishing daily? On weekly? I believe I chose daily. Daily, weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, semi-monthly, different things like that. So whatever the host had selected at that time, and you can see like this podcast, Passive Real Estate Strategies, it was founded 3 years ago. So obviously that could be a little bit different now, but just want to give you that heads up on that. And something is what you could do is you could click added. So I've obviously targeted this podcast for one of our clients. You can say create new list. You can build out your list. So I definitely use it for our clients and what we're doing and building it out. You can go to the contact us so you can see the different contacts. So obviously there's 3 different ones. So then you would want to do a little bit more research. You'd want to search for Justin. You'd want to search for his podcast and see what website comes up. But obviously there's like a lot of different podcasts. And then you could click like, I'm going to build a list. And then you could say add. So eventually you're going to have a list. And what the cool thing is like, let's say, we have this list for Robert, a client of ours. And, this is what I was testing out when I was building it out for him. And what you could see is you could come over here and you could see status. And in one of my other videos, one of my other podcasts, I talked about when you're building out this list, you could build it out on a spreadsheet and make sure to follow up. But what I find about Rephonic, which is nice, which you can also, use, is you can do status. So like this podcast, they're all prospect. Maybe you pitched. Okay, now that you know that you pitched within here, and then you followed up, and then warm. You could say the host says, "Yeah, let me like take a look at this information, and I'll get back to you." Just something simple like that. Then obviously you have your book section, so you can mark down that the podcast interview has been booked. And then obviously lost in my book would be like, I reached out to this podcast, I followed up once, maybe twice, I haven't heard back from them. That's probably going to be a lost podcast. So I think it's very cool. What you could do is like, again, on this list, like if you want to throw it into a Google spreadsheet, so you could just like, I would export it. Obviously that exported it. And what you could do from there is you go into Google Drive folder, you could add it there, and then you could take the information however you want and edit it a little bit from there. But I find that Rephonic is a great tool to use. And for those listening, I highly recommend checking it out. And it's spelled Rephonic. And I believe, again, it's going to run you about $150 per month, but it's very well worth it. There's a ton of tools and features that you can do for it, whether you're someone that's experienced and wants to find new podcasts to go on. And what I would do, or what I find is cool, and for those watching and listening, I'm just checking off some of these X's. So I'm going to go to the episodes tab. You're like, what podcasts have I been on? Maybe I've been on 50 shows and I want to find new podcasts for me to go on. So what I do is I'll just type in, like, let's say if I'm typing in my name into the episodes. So I'm going to type it through. And I can see, so I'm going to sort just by newer podcasts. So newest podcast. So you can see these are the different podcasts that I have been on. So what I would do is I would come here and I would click the podcast and I would click add to list. I would create a new list and I would put my name. So then that way I know that these are all the podcasts that I have been on. So that way, if I'm researching new shows, in this process, it's fairly click-like. One of our clients, he's been on 179, 180 podcasts. That took me like 30 minutes to go through and build out that list for him. But if someone's paying us, I don't want to be reaching out to a show that I've already been on. Maybe you have someone on your team that's going to be reaching out for you. You don't want to be going on the same podcast twice. Not to say that you shouldn't, but for the most part, I would hold off on going on the same podcast twice, unless you're going at least like a year out, because you got to have something new to share on the podcast. But that's really why I recommend using Rephonic, why we recommend using it as a tool at our company. And I hope everyone found this video helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me on LinkedIn under my name, Trevor Oldham. For those listening to the podcast, for those watching the video on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment and I'll be happy to help you out in any way that I can.